The music academy was buzzing with its usual pre-audition energy. Every year, families arrived early, carrying polished instruments and thick folders of certificates that showed how many years of training their children had. The hallways smelled faintly of old wood and warm lights, and the sound of scales drifted from practice rooms. It was a day filled with nerves, hopes, and expectations. The director of the academy, a man known for his sharp eyes and strict standards, stood near the entrance with his clipboard. He didn't smile much. People often said he could look at a student for 5 seconds and already know whether they were worth his time. Whether this was true or not, no one dared to question him. He was respected, feared, and admired all at once. Parents would often hurry their kids a little straighter whenever he walked by. No one wanted to be judged before the audition even started. That morning, as more children arrived, some in formal clothes, some holding their instruments as carefully as newborn babies, the director's attention shifted to a woman and a boy stepping through the doors. The boy was thin, wearing clothes that looked like they had been washed many times. His shoes had scratches on them, and his hair was a little messy, as if he had rushed to get ready. He didn't carry any instrument case. He didn't even seem sure where to stand. The mother tried to look confident, but the way she held her purse tightly showed that she was nervous too. She walked up to the registration table and quietly gave the boy's name. The volunteer checked the list, nodded, and handed her a small slip with his audition number. The director, who had been standing nearby, raised an eyebrow. He wasn't used to seeing applicants arrive like this, without the polished appearance or the proud, eager look most other families carried. Something about the boy made him pause. Maybe it was the boy's silence, or maybe the way he kept his eyes on the floor, almost as if he felt he didn't belong there. The mother cleared her throat and said, He wants to audition for the piano category." A few parents standing close enough to hear exchanged surprised looks. One of them whispered to another, as if the words might slip out accidentally, "Piano? With no teacher? No instrument? How?" The director let out a short laugh. Not a gentle one, but the type that said he didn't believe a single word of what he had just heard. "If that boy can play piano," he said loudly enough that the nearby staff heard him, "I'll kneel right here." Some of the staff chuckled, though a few looked uncomfortable. The mother's face turned slightly red, but she stayed quiet. The boy heard the comment too. Anyone would have, but he didn't react. He just stood still, holding the slip of paper with his number as if it were the only solid thing in the room. The director turned away, already assuming the boy would be no different from the many underprepared students he'd seen over the years. He didn't even ask the boy any questions. To him, the matter was already clear. Meanwhile, the mother and son walked toward the waiting area. They sat on a bench near the back, where the noise was a little quieter. The boy looked around at the other students. Some were practicing finger exercises in the air. Others were adjusting their clothes or reviewing sheet music with their parents. The boy had none of those things. No sheet music, no teacher whispering advice, no fancy clothes. Just his nervous hands resting on his lap. His mother gently touched his shoulder. "Just do your best," she whispered. "That's all you need to do." He nodded, but he didn't speak. He rarely spoke when he was anxious. Instead, he closed his eyes for a moment, remembering the sound of the small keyboard at home, one with a few broken keys, one that could never sound like a real piano but was still his only way to practice. He thought about the long nights he sat in the dim light, teaching himself notes, copying melodies he heard online, hoping someday he would play on a real grand piano. This was his chance. Maybe his only chance? The announcements began calling students to different rooms. Each time a number was called, a child stood up with a parent, usually dressed neatly, carrying something important looking. Their footsteps were confident. Some had expressions filled with excitement. Others looked like they wanted to faint. When the boy's number was called, he stood up slowly. His mother squeezed his hand and gave him an encouraging smile. "You'll be fine," she said softly. They walked through the hallway leading to the audition room. The hall felt longer than it really was. Every footstep echoed, every breath felt louder. The boy tried to calm himself. imagining keys beneath his fingers, imagining the first note, imagining the moment where everything else around him would disappear and only the music would matter. Inside the room, a panel of judges sat behind a long table. Sheets of paper were stacked neatly in front of them. A grand piano stood on the side, shining under the lights. The seat was adjusted slightly too high, as if someone taller had used it just before. The director was also in the room, standing at the back with his arms crossed. He didn't even hide the bored expression on his face when the boy entered. It was as if he had already made up his mind. While other students came in with instructors or accompanists, the boy came in with nothing. No books, no notes, no helper. Just himself. One of the judges asked, "Do you have a piece prepared?" The boy nodded. Double quotes. "Do you have your sheet music with you?" He shook his head gently. Another judge looked confused. "You've memorized it?" He nodded again. The director let out a sigh so loud it might as well have been a comment. The kind of sigh that said, "We're wasting time." A staff member moved toward the piano, ready to play the accompanist role, but the boy quietly said, "I would like to play alone, if that's okay." Everyone paused for a moment. It wasn't unusual, but it also wasn't common for a young applicant to choose to play solo. The judge nodded patiently. "All right. You may begin when you're ready." The boy took a slow breath and walked to the piano. His hands trembled slightly, and for a second he wondered if people were watching too closely, judging him before he even touched the keys. He sat down, adjusted the seat a tiny bit, and placed his fingers gently on the keys. They felt different from the plastic keys at home, cooler, smoother, heavier. This piano had strength. It had a soul. He could feel it. For a moment, everything in the room was silent. Even the director seemed to stop breathing. Then the boy closed his eyes and pressed the first key. At that moment, something shifted in the air, not because the music had begun, but because the sound of that single note was stronger and clearer than anyone expected from him. It was steady, confident, almost as if his nerves had dissolved the moment. He touched the piano, but that was only the beginning. He was just getting started. The room stayed completely silent after the first note, as if everyone there forgot how to breathe for a moment. The boy's fingers hovered over the keys, and even though his hands trembled slightly, his face slowly relaxed. It was the kind of calm that comes when someone steps into a place that feels familiar, like home, even if it's the first time they've ever been there. He pressed the second key, then the third, and soon the soft sound of the piano filled the entire hall. At first, the judges didn't react. They just watched him quietly, maybe expecting the music to fall apart after a few seconds. But it didn't. Instead, the notes grew clearer, steadier, almost like the boy had suddenly forgotten he was being watched. Outside the audition room, the hallway was still busy with nervous students waiting for their turn. Some stood there rehearsing finger exercises in the air. Others whispered last-minute advice from their parents. But inside that room, everything was different now. The boy had entered quietly and shyly, but the sound he was creating didn't match that image at all. The director, still standing at the back with his arms crossed, frowned slightly. It wasn't a negative frown, more like confusion. He tilted his head, as if trying to understand how this soft-spoken boy could suddenly transform into someone who played with such confidence, but the judges weren't confused. They leaned forward in their seats, trying to catch every detail. One of them even stopped writing notes on the paper in front of him. He simply listened, which was rare. Usually they wrote something during every performance. But right now, the music demanded their full attention. The boy's mother, who had been allowed to stand quietly near the wall, clasped her hands together. She wasn't smiling widely or making any big reactions. Instead, she watched her son with eyes that held both pride and fear. Pride because she knew how hard he had worked, and fear because she didn't know how the judges would react once the music stopped. Parents understood these moments better than anyone else. Meanwhile, the boy continued playing. Each note was placed with care. He wasn't rushing and he wasn't trying to show off. He simply played in a way that felt natural to him, as if the music lived somewhere deep inside and all he had to do was let it out. His hands moved smoothly across the keys. Sometimes he played softly, letting the notes float gently through the air. Other times his fingers pressed harder, bringing energy and emotion into the room. It wasn't a perfect performance, but that's what made it feel real. It didn't sound like something practiced only for a test. It sounded like something he loved. The judges noticed this too. One whispered to the other, "He's playing from instinct. It's not just memorized. He feels the music." The director heard the whisper and uncrossed his arms for the first time since the audition began. He stepped closer, though he tried not to make it obvious. His eyes were fixed on the boy now. He wasn't bored anymore. He wasn't amused. He was curious. Outside the room, another group of students walked past, laughing nervously about their performances. But inside the audition space, there was only the sound of the boy's fingers dancing across the keys. The piece he played wasn't one of the usual songs students choose for auditions. It wasn't something commonly taught. In fact, the judges couldn't immediately identify it. It had parts that sounded like a classic melody and other parts that felt like the boy was making them up as he went along. And somehow, it all blended together beautifully. The boy's shoulders softened as he played. His breathing steadied. He was no longer the unsure kid who walked in wearing old clothes and keeping his eyes low. At the piano, he became someone else, someone confident, someone expressive, someone who belonged there more than anyone expected. The director's comment from earlier echoed quietly in the background, "If that boy can play piano, I'll kneel right here." But now, he didn't seem so sure about what he had said. The music started building toward a high point. The boy's fingers moved faster now. It wasn't loud or dramatic, it was emotional. Anyone listening could tell that this moment meant something to him. Maybe he remembered those nights on his small keyboard at home, playing until everyone else had fallen asleep. Maybe he remembered how many times the keys got stuck or didn't sound right. Maybe he remembered wishing for a real piano, even though he didn't know if he would ever get to touch one. Whatever he was thinking, it came through in the notes. The judges exchanged looks again, not with confusion this time, but with a kind of surprise that said, "This boy might be something special." The staff members standing near the walls were also paying attention now. One of them even whispered, "Where did he learn this?" Who taught him? His mother heard the whisper but didn't answer. She simply watched her son, trying hard not to cry out of relief or emotion. She knew exactly how he learned it, by teaching himself night after night, practicing on a keyboard that had more flaws than working keys. But she didn't say that out loud. She wanted the music to speak for him. The boy moved into a softer section of the piece. The notes slowed down as if he were letting the room breathe again. Then he looked up slightly, not at the judges, not at his mother, but just ahead, almost like he was looking at a memory. The director watched this carefully. He knew what confidence in a performer looked like, and what fear looked like too. But this was neither. This was honesty. Pure, simple honesty expressed through sound. A few minutes later, the boy gently reached the end of his piece. The final note lingered in the air for a moment, like a small echo that didn't want to fade away. The boy slowly lifted his fingers from the keys, and just like that, the room was quiet again, but it wasn't the same silence as before. This silence felt heavier, filled with emotion, filled with something unspoken that everyone in the room could feel. The boy took a small breath, as if remembering where he was. He looked at the judges, unsure of what would happen next. He didn't smile, he didn't bow. He simply sat there, waiting. The judges didn't speak right away. One of them blinked a few times, almost as if he needed to make sure he had heard the performance correctly. Another judge looked down at his papers, then back up again, unable to hide the surprise on his face. The director was the first to move. He stepped forward slowly, no longer hiding his interest. His earlier confidence, his belief that he already knew everything, seemed to disappear. There was something in his eyes now, something softer, but instead of speaking, he stayed quiet. He couldn't find the words yet. The longest moment passed. The boy's mother held her breath. The staff waited silently. Finally, one of the judges leaned forward, hands clasped, and said gently, "Thank you." That was unexpected. The boy lowered his gaze, not sure if unexpected was a good thing or a bad thing, but the judge added, In a very good way. The boy blinked in surprise. His mother let out a breath she had been holding for too long. Another judge said, "You played beautifully." We weren't expecting that at all. Even the staff nodded quietly. The director still said nothing, but the look on his face said everything. His earlier laughter, his earlier doubts, they didn't fit the moment anymore. Not after what he had heard. The boy stood slowly, giving a small nod, and stepped away from the piano. His hands were still slightly shaking, but for the first time since he walked in, he looked a little taller. He had been judged before he even touched the keys. But after hearing him play, no one in that room saw him the same way anymore, and the director, the one who laughed, wasn't laughing now. There was a quiet hum in the room as the boy stood by the piano, waiting for someone to speak. His fingers, which had only moments ago danced across the keys with such confidence, were now still. His heart was pounding in his chest. Even though he had just performed his best, he didn't know what was coming next. Would they judge him based on his clothes? Would they think he wasn't good enough? That he didn't belong here with all the other students who had expensive instruments and years of training? His mother, standing by the wall, seemed to be holding her breath. The boy could feel her presence even though she wasn't speaking. It was the kind of quiet support that only a mother could give, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her eyes not leaving him for a second. He wanted to look at her, but he couldn't. His focus was on the judges, on the director, on anyone who might give him an answer. The room felt like it was holding its breath too, as if time itself was pausing, waiting to see what would happen next. Finally, after what felt like forever, the first judge cleared their throat. They leaned forward in their chair, pushing their glasses back up the bridge of their nose. The boy's heart skipped a beat. "That was unexpected," the judge said slowly, his voice calm but filled with a surprise that couldn't be hidden. "In a very good way." The boy blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. "Unexpected? In a good way?" He looked around at the other judges, trying to gauge their reactions. One of them was scribbling something on the paper in front of them, while another simply sat back, watching him closely. The director, still standing at the back, hadn't moved. But the way he was looking at the boy now was different. Gone was the skepticism, the doubt. In its place was something that almost resembled respect. The judge who had spoken earlier smiled slightly, the kind of smile that seemed to break the tension. "You didn't just play a song? You made it your own? It wasn't perfect, but it was real. We can feel that." The boy was still processing what was happening. He'd never expected to hear words like this, not in a place like this. Not in front of people who were used to seeing the best of the best. He had come in thinking they would laugh at him, that they would see he didn't have the fancy training or the perfect background. He had prepared himself for disappointment, even though he was trying his best to hide the fear. But now, here were these words that made him feel like he had done something right. Maybe even something great. The music had done something to them, something they hadn't expected. And somehow that felt like a victory. He swallowed, trying to find his voice. "Thank you," he said quietly. The words felt so small compared to the music he had just played. He wanted to say more, to explain where he had learned to play, how many nights he had spent teaching himself, but he didn't know if the words would come out right. And, really, at that moment, they didn't seem to matter anyway. The music had spoken for him. Another judge, a woman with short, dark hair, leaned forward and looked at him with a warm expression. "You have a lot of potential. There's something in the way you play, your instincts, the way you feel the music. That's something a lot of students don't have. They can follow the notes, but you play with your heart." The boy blinked, still in shock. No one had ever told him that before. Not in those words. His fingers had always moved because of the way the music made him feel, not because he was following a set of instructions. He had always believed that music wasn't just about the notes, that it was about what was inside, what was hidden beneath the surface of the keys. He just didn't know how to say that. But somehow this judge had understood. Somehow these people could see past his nerves, past the old clothes and the lack of formal training, and they saw the music inside him. The director shifted slightly at the back of the room, and the boy noticed. The man was still watching him, but now he seemed more interested. His arms were no longer crossed, and his face no longer held the amused skepticism it had earlier. He seemed thoughtful. His expression was still hard to read, but there was no mistaking the shift in his gaze. "Tell me," the director finally said, breaking the silence. His voice was deep, steady, and firm. "How long have you been playing?" The boy hesitated, feeling a little unsure of how to answer. "About 2 years," he said quietly, almost as if he didn't believe it himself. He had always been embarrassed to admit how little formal training he had. The other students, the ones with their polished instruments and fancy lessons, had years of experience. But 2 years felt like both too long and not enough at the same time. The director didn't seem surprised by the answer. He nodded slowly, considering. "And you taught yourself?" The boy nodded. "Yes, I couldn't afford lessons, so I just learned from online videos and books. I practiced every night, even if it was just for an hour or two." The director's eyes softened a little, though he didn't smile. "Impressive," he said, his voice steady. "Most students would have given up by now. But you didn't, you kept going." The boy wasn't sure how to respond to that. It wasn't like he had done anything extraordinary. He had just done what he had to do. He didn't have a choice. The piano, even if it was just a small, broken keyboard at home, had become his escape, his way to feel something bigger than the world around him. He wasn't sure why he was drawn to it, but the music had always been there, calling to him, and he couldn't ignore it. There was a moment of quiet again, but this time it didn't feel like an uncomfortable silence. It felt like everyone in the room was thinking, processing, trying to understand what had just happened. The boy's performance had caught them off guard, yes, but it had also impressed them. He had shown them something they didn't expect, something that made them rethink what they thought they knew about talent and ability. The judge with the glasses spoke again, his voice more gentle now. "You know, many students come in here expecting to play what's easy, what's been taught to them over and over again. But you didn't play like that. You played like you had something to say." The boy smiled just a little. He hadn't thought of it that way before. But now that he was hearing it, it made sense. He had something to say. He had always had something to say. Music was his voice, his way of speaking when words didn't feel enough. And right now, in this room, in front of these strangers who didn't know him, his music had done all the talking. The director nodded again, his lips pressed together as if he were deciding something important. Finally he spoke, and this time his tone was different. It wasn't as cold, as distant. It was more respectful. "You've earned our attention," the director said. "You've earned my attention. I'll say this, you're more than just a kid with a keyboard. You're a musician. You have a future in this. And we're going to make sure you have every chance to see it through." The boy's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know how to react. He wasn't used to hearing such things. Not from people like this. He had never imagined that someone like the director would say anything like that to him. He had never imagined he would make it this far, let alone be told he had a future in music. His mother, standing by the wall, finally allowed herself a small, quiet smile. She had known this day would come. She had always believed in her son, in his talent, even when no one else did. She had believed when no one else had. The boy looked up at her, and for the first time that day, he wasn't afraid. He wasn't uncertain. He had done it. He had made it. The director cleared his throat. "You'll hear from us soon. We'll let you know what happens next. But for now, you've shown us exactly what we needed to see." And as the boy turned to leave the room, his heart was no longer full of doubt or fear. It was full of something else, hope. The boy left the audition room slowly, his footsteps hesitant at first but gaining confidence with each step. His heart was still racing, and his thoughts were all over the place. It was hard to believe what had just happened. He had walked into that room thinking he would fail, that his nerves would get the best of him, that the judges would see through his nervousness and dismiss him like everyone else always had. But now, as he walked down the hallway toward the waiting area, everything felt different. His hands were still slightly trembling, but it wasn't because of fear anymore. It was the kind of nervousness you feel after something big has just happened, and you're not entirely sure what it means yet. His thoughts were racing, trying to make sense of everything. Was that real? Had they really said those things about his performance? Had the director really looked at him with respect instead of skepticism? He barely noticed the other students sitting in the hallway, all with their own nerves and worries. They were still practicing, adjusting their sheet music, pacing around with their instruments. They had no idea what had just happened in that room, how the boy's quiet performance had changed everything. He finally reached the small bench where his mother was sitting, her hands folded in her lap. She looked up as he approached, her eyes full of quiet hope. She didn't ask him how it had gone. She didn't need to. She had seen how he carried himself into that room. She had seen the way his hands had gripped the sides of the piano, the way he had played from his heart. She didn't need to hear the details because she already knew. The boy sat down beside her, his heart still pounding, but now for a different reason. He couldn't help but smile slightly, even though he wasn't sure why. Maybe it was because he had made it through the audition without falling apart. Maybe it was because for the first time, someone had actually seen him, not as the boy with the old keyboard, not as the one who didn't belong, but as a musician. A real musician. "I think it went well," he said quietly, his voice still uncertain, though there was a hint of pride in it. His mother didn't smile right away. Instead, she just nodded and placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'm proud of you," she said softly, her voice full of warmth. "No matter what happens, you've already proven something today. You've shown everyone that you belong." The boy looked at her, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he wasn't alone in this. His mother had always believed in him, even when the world didn't. And now, maybe, just maybe, the world was starting to see him too. They sat in silence for a while, the noise of the other students filling the background, but neither of them really noticed it. The boy was lost in his thoughts, trying to process everything that had just happened. His performance, the judge's reactions, the director's words. He kept hearing those words in his head, "You've earned my attention." It was hard to wrap his mind around it. He had walked into that room thinking no one would notice him. He had walked in, not expecting anything, but now it felt like the door to something bigger had opened. After what felt like hours, the door to the audition room finally opened. The boy's stomach twisted as he stood up. He knew this moment was coming, but he didn't know what it would feel like. The judges had said they would let him know what happened next, but now the uncertainty was starting to feel heavy. The director appeared in the doorway, still as composed as ever, but there was something different about him. He wasn't standing as far away as before. He wasn't giving off that same distant air of disinterest. Instead, he was looking at the boy like he was seeing him for the first time. The boy's heart skipped a beat. This was it. This was the moment when everything would be decided. "Can I speak with you for a moment?" the director asked, his voice calm but with an undertone of something. Deeper, it wasn't the same casual tone he had used earlier. This was more serious, more respectful. The boy's mother gave him a reassuring glance, then stood up, letting him walk forward. The boy swallowed hard but nodded, stepping toward the director. His hands were sweaty now, and he had to take a deep breath before speaking. "Of course," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. The director stepped aside, allowing him to follow into a small side room. It was quieter here, with just a single window that let in the soft light of the afternoon. The boy felt the weight of the silence, but somehow it didn't feel as heavy as before. The director closed the door behind him, and they stood there for a moment, both of them waiting. Finally, the director spoke again, his voice steady but with a slight pause, like he was choosing his words carefully. "You surprised me," he said, his gaze fixed on the boy. "And I don't say that lightly." The boy's heart skipped another beat. The director's words hit him harder than he expected. Surprised him? The director, the one who had been so skeptical earlier, was now saying this. He tried to keep his composure, but inside he was struggling to process the change in tone. "I've been doing this for a long time," the director continued, "and I've seen many students come through here, all with different backgrounds and levels of skill. But you played with something more than just technique. You played with heart. And that's something I don't often see. The boy wasn't sure how to respond to that. No one had ever spoken to him like this. It felt so real, so honest. The words were more than just praise, they were a recognition of something deeper, something he had always known but never put into words. "I know you don't have the same training as some of the others here," the director said, his voice softer now. "And I know you didn't come from the same background, but you have something that goes beyond all of that. You have the ability to make music come alive, to make it speak. That's a gift, one that can't be taught." The boy's chest tightened. He wanted to say something, to express how much this meant to him, but the words felt inadequate. He wasn't used to receiving this kind of feedback, especially not from someone like the director. The director paused, his eyes narrowing as if he were making a decision in his mind. He looked the boy over once more, his gaze thoughtful. Then, after a long moment, he nodded. "Because of that," the director said finally, "I'd like to offer you a scholarship to this academy. Not just for your potential, but for your determination. I believe you have what it takes to be something truly remarkable in music. And I want to help you get there." The words hit the boy like a wave. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment he wasn't sure if he had heard him right. "A scholarship?" he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes," the director said with a firm nod. "I think you deserve a chance to explore this talent further, and I believe this academy can help you do that. We'll work with you to refine your skills, give you the tools you need. But the music you bring, the heart you have, that's something we can't teach. You've already got that." The boy didn't know what to say. He was overwhelmed, caught between disbelief and joy. He had never expected this. He had never thought that the boy with the old keyboard, the boy who couldn't afford lessons, would ever be given such an opportunity. And yet, here he was, standing in front of a man who had just offered him a chance to build a future in music. "Thank you," he finally managed to say, his voice shaky but full of gratitude. The director gave him a small smile. "You've earned it," he said. "Now it's up to you to make the most of it." The boy left the room, his heart soaring. His mother was waiting outside, and when she saw him, she didn't need to ask. The smile on his face said it all. They didn't need to say much as they walked out of the building. The world felt different now. The boy had stepped into that room unsure of everything, unsure of himself. But now, as they walked out together, he felt like the world was full of possibility. His dream had just begun. And for the first time, he was no longer just a boy with a keyboard. He was a musician. The days that followed the audition felt like a blur to the boy. Everything had changed so quickly, and he was still trying to wrap his mind around the idea that he had been given a scholarship to the academy. It was something he had only ever dreamed about, something that seemed far out of reach, like a distant star in the sky. But now it was real. He had a chance, a real chance to do something he loved. The first few days after the announcement were filled with a whirlwind of forms, orientations, and new faces. The boy had never been in a place like this before, an academy full of students who had been playing music for years, some of them with private tutors, others with famous teachers. They had their own instruments, expensive pianos, and a confidence that came from years of experience. They were nothing like him. They had everything he didn't: fancy clothes, polished shoes, and knowledge that seemed so much deeper than his own. He felt out of place at first, like he was pretending to belong in a world he didn't understand. The halls were filled with students talking about their last performance, their upcoming concerts, and the latest pieces they were learning. The boy felt small in comparison. He had learned everything on his own, with no one to guide him except for the music he heard and the little keyboard he had at home. He wasn't used to being around so many skilled people. He wasn't used to being the one who didn't know something. But as the days went on, something started to change. Slowly, he began to feel more comfortable. It wasn't just the classes or the lessons. It was the atmosphere. There was something about being surrounded by people who cared so much about music that it rubbed off on him. It didn't matter that he didn't know the technical terms for every scale or that his sight reading wasn't perfect. What mattered was the love for the music, the drive to get better, and the belief that he could grow too. One day, as he was walking down the hallway toward one of his lessons, he noticed a small group of students gathered around a piano. They were talking animatedly, laughing, and exchanging stories about their recent performances. The boy hesitated for a moment, unsure whether he should approach or just keep walking. But something inside him told him to stop. He took a deep breath and walked over. "Hey," he said, his voice a little shaky. "Do you mind if I sit in for a bit?" The students looked at him curiously. Some of them had already seen him around, but no one had really spoken to him yet. They nodded, one of them shifting slightly to make room. The boy sat down on the edge of the group, feeling the warmth of the conversation, even though he wasn't saying much. They talked about the latest pieces they were working on, the hardest parts of the music they were learning, and their upcoming recitals. As he listened, the boy realized that they weren't talking about anything he couldn't understand. Yes, they knew more technical terms than he did, but they were still talking about music in the same way he had always felt it. They were sharing how the music made them feel, how certain pieces challenged them, and how they sometimes struggled with the same frustrations he had. It was then that he realized something important. They weren't as different from him as he had thought. They all had their own journeys, their own struggles, their own doubts. Some of them had more experience, more formal training, but they all loved the music in the same way. They all wanted to get better, just like he did. Over the next few weeks, he began to talk more with the other students. Slowly but surely, he started to make friends. They shared tips on how to improve certain techniques, how to approach difficult passages, and how to relax during a performance. The boy began to realize that, while his path had been different from theirs, the end goal was the same. They were all learning. They were all growing. But despite his growing confidence, there were still moments of doubt. Sometimes in the middle of a lesson, when the teacher would explain a new concept or introduce a new piece of music, the boy would feel lost. He didn't have the years of training that the others had. He didn't have the background that so many of them had. There were times when he would look around the room and see how easily the other students understood the material. They could sight read perfectly, their fingers moving quickly and confidently across the keys. He would look at his own hands and wonder if he was ever going to be as good as them. It was on one of those days, during a particularly difficult class, that the boy began to lose his confidence. He was sitting at the piano, trying to keep up with the rest of the class as the teacher played through a new piece. His fingers stumbled over the keys, missing notes, and he felt the frustration bubbling inside of him. After class, he stayed behind, hoping to catch up. But the more he practiced, the more frustrated he became. The music that had once come to him so naturally now seemed like a puzzle he couldn't solve. His fingers didn't move as quickly as they used to, and the notes felt like they were slipping through his hands. He was about to give up for the day when he felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned around to see one of his classmates standing there, a friendly smile on their face. "Hey, I noticed you were struggling with that passage," the student said. "Want me to show you a trick that helped me?" The boy hesitated, feeling embarrassed. He didn't want to admit that he was struggling, that he wasn't as good as everyone else. But there was something about the student's smile, something kind and non-judgmental, that made him feel like it was okay to ask for help. "I guess it wouldn't hurt," he said, his voice a little quieter than usual. The student sat down at the piano beside him and played through the passage slowly, breaking it down into smaller parts. "You don't need to rush it," the student said. "Just take your time. Break it down and focus on each hand separately. You'll get it." The boy watched carefully, following the student's instructions. Slowly, the music started to make sense again. It wasn't perfect, but it felt better. For the first time that day, he felt like he could catch up. "Thanks," the boy said, his voice filled with gratitude. "No problem," the student replied. "We all start somewhere. Don't worry about keeping up with everyone else. Just focus on your own progress." Those words stayed with the boy for the rest of the day. He realized that he had been comparing himself to others too much, measuring his progress against theirs. But everyone had their own journey. And as long as he kept going, as long as he kept improving, he was on the right path. The next day, he went to class with a new attitude. Instead of worrying about how fast he could learn the pieces or how well he could keep up, he focused on himself. He focused on what he needed to learn, not what everyone else had already mastered. And with that shift in mindset, things started to click. His playing became more relaxed. The pressure to be perfect melted away, and the joy of playing returned. As the weeks turned into months, the boy continued to grow, both as a musician and as a person. He worked hard, practiced every day, and pushed through the difficult moments. He still had a long way to go, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. He wasn't just the boy with the old keyboard anymore. He was a student at a real music academy, surrounded by talented people who supported him and believed in him. And every day he was getting better. Slowly but surely he was learning to believe in himself too. One evening, as he sat at the piano practicing a new piece, he caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror. He didn't recognize the boy staring back at him. He looked different, not just in the way he looked, but in the way he carried himself. He had come so far from the shy, uncertain boy who had walked into that audition room months ago. Now, he sat at the piano with purpose, his hands moving across the keys with confidence. And for the first time in a long while, he smiled. He knew there was still much to learn, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that he was on the journey that he had always dreamed of. And that was enough. He wasn't just playing music anymore, he was living it.